The moment I saw what they'd written about me in that prenup, I knew my fairy tale was actually a nightmare. But what they didn't realize was that while they were busy trying to cage me, I was learning exactly how dirty their fortune really was. My name is Zoe Hartwell, and on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I turned their own wedding into their worst confession. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started with a text message that made my stomach drop to the floor. Marcus had sent me a simple message that Tuesday morning. Family lawyer wants to meet with us tomorrow. Standard stuff before the wedding. Nothing to worry about. I stared at those words while sipping coffee in my tiny apartment near the Coastal Heritage Museum, where I worked as a curator. The morning light streamed through my secondhand curtains, casting everything in a golden glow that felt too hopeful for what was coming. I should have known something was wrong when Victoria Blackwood insisted on being present at the meeting. Marcus's mother rarely involved herself in anything she considered beneath her attention, yet there she was, sitting like a marble statue in the plush leather chair of Sterling and Associates. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair didn't move when she turned her head, and her navy Chanel suit probably cost more than my monthly salary. Richard Blackwood sat beside her, scrolling through his phone with the detached air of someone who had better places to be but needed to oversee the proceedings anyway. David Chen, the family attorney, spread the documents across his mahogany desk with ceremonial precision. The papers were thick, expensive stock that whispered wealth with every rustle. Marcus reached for my hand and squeezed it, his smile warm and reassuring. "Just a formality, sweetheart," he said, and I believed him, because I loved him. Because I thought love was enough to bridge the canyon between his world and mine. "Miss Hartwell," David began, his voice carrying the neutral tone lawyers perfect when delivering bad news wrapped in legal language. "The Blackwood family has prepared a comprehensive prenuptial agreement to protect both parties' interests." He slid the document toward me, and I noticed how Victoria's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I opened to the first page and began reading. The language was dense, full of whereas clauses and party of the first part terminology, but slowly the meaning became clear. This wasn't a prenup. This was a declaration of war disguised as a legal document. The first section stripped me of any claim to Blackwood Maritime Holdings, which I expected. Old family money, generational wealth, I understood wanting to protect that. But then came Section 4, which required me to forfeit my career as a museum curator and devote myself entirely to supporting the family's philanthropic and social endeavors. Section 7 demanded I relocate from my beloved Charleston to whatever residence the family deemed appropriate. Section 12 required my complete financial dependence on an allowance system, with all major purchases requiring family approval. But it was Section 15 that made my hands tremble. In the event of divorce, I would receive exactly $100,000, regardless of the length of the marriage or circumstances surrounding its dissolution. The kicker was the final clause. I would be prohibited from discussing any aspect of the Blackwood family's private affairs, business dealings, or personal conduct for a period of 50 years following any separation. I looked up from the papers to find 3 pairs of eyes watching me with varying degrees of expectation. Marcus looked uncomfortable but resigned, like someone who had already fought this battle and lost. Victoria watched me with the predatory patience of a cat observing a cornered mouse. Richard had finally put down his phone and was studying my reaction with cool calculation. "I need some time to review this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Victoria's laugh was crystalline and sharp. "Oh, my dear, there's nothing to review. This is quite standard for families of our position. We simply cannot have outside influences affecting our legacy." She leaned forward slightly, her perfume expensive and suffocating. "Surely you understand that Marcus is inheriting more than just money. He's inheriting responsibility to preserve what generations of Blackwoods have built." "Of course I understand that," I replied, careful to keep my tone respectful despite the fire building in my chest. "But some of these terms seem rather restrictive. Richard spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Miss Hartwell, you come from Millbrook, Georgia. Population what, 3,000? You work at a small museum making what, 40,000 a year? This marriage elevates you to a position most people only dream of. The terms simply ensure that elevation comes with appropriate responsibility. The condescension in his tone was like a slap. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside me, but he didn't speak up. That silence would haunt me for weeks. I've seen your little apartment, Victoria continued, her smile never wavering. Charming in its own way, of course, but hardly suitable for a Blackwood. The family will provide you with everything you could possibly need or want. All we ask in return is that you understand your place in preserving our family's reputation and interests. I felt heat creeping up my neck, but I forced myself to remain calm. And if I have concerns about specific clauses? David Chen cleared his throat. The document is quite comprehensive, Miss Hartwell. The family has been very generous in their considerations. Generous? The word slipped out before I could stop it. Victoria's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Yes, generous. Marcus could marry anyone, my dear. Anyone at all. Young women from prominent families would consider themselves fortunate to receive such an opportunity. We're offering you a chance to be part of something magnificent, something lasting. All we ask is that you respect what that means. I looked at Marcus, hoping to see some sign that he would defend me, that he would tell his parents they were going too far. Instead, he squeezed my hand again and said, Zoe, I know it seems overwhelming, but this is just how these things work in families like mine. Once we're married, once you're part of the family, it'll all feel different. That was the moment something crystallized inside me. Not anger, not yet, but a cold clarity that cut through all my romantic illusions. They weren't asking me to marry Marcus. They were asking me to disappear into their idea of who I should be, to dissolve myself completely into their vision of an appropriate wife. I'll need to take this home and read it thoroughly, I said, gathering the papers. Of course, David said smoothly. However, please note that the wedding is in 3 weeks. We'll need the signed documents returned no later than 1 week before the ceremony, to ensure all legal requirements are met. As we left the office, Marcus was quiet until we reached his Tesla in the parking garage. I know that was intense, he said, starting the engine. But they mean well, Zoe. They just want to protect what they've built. Protect it from me, you mean? He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. That's not how they see it. They see it as protecting us, protecting our future together. I stared out the window at the Charleston skyline, the historic spires and modern buildings blending together in the afternoon light. Marcus, did you read that prenup before today? A pause. I knew the general outline. Did you know about the career requirement? About the allowance system? Another pause, longer this time. My parents have traditional views about marriage roles. Traditional views. I repeated the words, tasting their bitterness. Your mother just told me I should consider myself fortunate that you're willing to marry beneath your station. She didn't say that. She didn't have to. It was in every word, every glance, every perfectly polite smile. I turned to look at him. Marcus, they want me to give up everything I am to become their idea of what you should have. He pulled into traffic, his jaw tight. It's not forever, Zoe. Once we're established, once they see that you're committed to the family, things will relax. They'll see what I see in you. But I was beginning to understand that what Marcus saw in me wasn't enough to override what his family demanded from me. The drive back to my apartment passed in strained silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. That evening, I spread the prenup across my dining table and read every word 3 times. Each reading revealed new humiliations I'd missed in the shock of the first encounter. There was a clause about appropriate social conduct that essentially gave the family veto power over my friendships.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Another section detailed expectations for family gatherings that read like a behavior manual for a 1950s housewife. The most insulting part was an appendix that outlined my duties as Marcus's wife, including hosting dinner parties, accompanying him to business functions, and maintaining an appearance befitting the Blackwood name. I called Elena, my best friend since college, and read her selected portions over the phone. "They want you to, what?" she practically shrieked when I got to the career forfeiture clause. "Give up museum work to focus on family obligations." "Zoe, you have a master's degree in art history. You've been working toward the head curator position for 2 years. They want you to throw that away to become what, a decorative wife?" Apparently. Elena was quiet for a moment. "Honey, I have to ask, is Marcus worth this?" I looked around my small apartment, at the artwork I'd collected over the years, at the books that lined my shelves, at the life I'd built for myself, inch by careful inch. I thought he was. But I'm starting to wonder if the Marcus I fell in love with actually exists, or if he's just another construction of the Blackwood family image. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not signing this thing as it stands." The next few days passed in a blur of awkward conversations and mounting tension. Marcus called multiple times, his voice growing more strained with each conversation. "My parents are asking about the prenup. They want to know if you have any questions." "I have a lot of questions, Marcus. Starting with whether you actually want to marry me or just a woman willing to play the role your family has written." "That's not fair, Zoe. You know I love you." "Do I?" "Because your love seems to come with an awful lot of conditions I never knew about." By Friday, Victoria called me directly. Her voice was honey over steel when she spoke. "Zoe, darling, I understand you have some concerns about the prenuptial agreement. Perhaps we could meet for lunch and discuss them, woman to woman." Something in her tone set off alarm bells, but I agreed. We met at the Charleston Harbor Club, Victoria's domain, where she reigned as the unchallenged queen of old Southern money. The dining room overlooked the harbor, all crystal chandeliers and fresh orchids, the kind of place where conversations were conducted in whispers, and every gesture was calculated for maximum effect. Victoria ordered for both of us, without asking what I wanted, then leaned back in her chair with the confident smile of someone who had never lost a battle she considered important. "Zoe, dear, I want you to understand something. The Blackwood family has survived and thrived for over 2 centuries because we've learned to protect what matters. We've seen what happens when the wrong influences enter old families. Fortunes lost, reputations destroyed, legacies crumbling because someone failed to maintain proper standards." She paused to sip her wine, letting her words sink in. "Now, I don't doubt that you care for Marcus. But caring isn't enough. Marriage in families like ours isn't just about personal happiness. It's about continuation, about ensuring that what we've built endures. Mrs. Blackwood, I respect what your family has accomplished, but I'm not asking to destroy anything. I'm asking to be treated as an equal partner in a marriage." Her laugh was soft and devastating. "Equal? Oh, my sweet girl. You can't possibly be equal to something you don't understand. Marcus isn't just inheriting money. He's inheriting obligations, expectations, a way of life that's been refined over generations. You've lived in a small town, worked a small job, dreamed small dreams. That's not your fault, but it's also not something that can be overcome by good intentions." The food arrived, some elaborate seafood dish I had no appetite for. Victoria continued eating, as if she hadn't just delivered a character assassination with perfect table manners. "The prenup isn't meant to be insulting, dear. It's meant to be protective. It protects you from expectations you can't possibly meet, and it protects the family from influences that could prove damaging. Everyone wins." "And if I refuse to sign it?" Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Well, that would be unfortunate. For everyone involved." She took her bite, chewed thoughtfully, then continued. "Marcus is a good son, Zoe. He values family harmony. If you force him to choose between his family and someone who refuses to understand her place in his world, well, I think we both know what choice he'll make." The threat was delivered with such elegant politeness that it took me a moment to fully process it. But there it was, wrapped in silk and tied with a bow. Sign the prenup or lose Marcus entirely. I excused myself to the restroom, not because I needed to go, but because I needed a moment to breathe without Victoria's predatory gaze fixed on me. In the marble-appointed ladies' room, I stared at my reflection in the gilt-framed mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the conversation I'd just endured. But as I stood there, something shifted. The humiliation began to crystallize into something harder, clearer. Victoria Blackwood thought she could break me down with her careful threats and polite condescension. She thought I would crumble under the weight of her family's expectations and crawl back to sign whatever document they put in front of me. She was wrong. When I returned to the table, Victoria was checking her phone with the air of someone whose time was far too valuable to be wasted much longer on such trivial matters. "I'll need more time to consider the agreement," I said, sitting down. "Of course, dear. But remember, the wedding is in just over 2 weeks. These things do require time to process properly." That evening, I called Marcus and asked him to come over. When he arrived, I could see the stress in his face, the way his shoulders carried the weight of family pressure and personal conflict. "We need to talk about the prenup," I said. He sat heavily on my couch, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Zoe, please, can't we just sign it and move forward? I promise, once we're married, once my parents see that you're committed to the family, things will get easier." "Marcus, listen to what you're saying. You're asking me to prove my commitment by giving up everything that makes me who I am. That's not what I'm asking, isn't it? The prenup requires me to quit my job, move where your family wants me to live, ask permission for major purchases, and accept an allowance like I'm a child. In exchange for what? The privilege of being Mrs. Marcus Blackwood?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "My family has certain expectations." "And what about your expectations? What about what you want for our marriage?" When he looked up, I saw something that broke my heart. Resignation. "I want us to be happy, Zoe, but I also can't fight my entire family for the rest of my life." That night, after Marcus left, I sat alone in my apartment and faced the truth I'd been avoiding. The man I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd courted me with poetry and spontaneous weekend trips and talk of building a life together, that man was disappearing under the weight of his family's expectations. The Marcus who sat on my couch asking me to surrender my identity for family harmony wasn't the same person who'd told me he loved my independence and ambition. I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to sign the prenup, but I also wasn't going to simply refuse and walk away. If the Blackwood family wanted to play power games, if they wanted to treat me like an outsider who needed to be controlled and contained, then they were about to learn exactly what this small-town girl was capable of. I opened my laptop and began to research. If I was going to war with one of Charleston's oldest and most powerful families, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. More importantly, I needed to understand what they were so desperate to protect. What I found in those late-night hours of digging would make their prenup look like a love letter. The first thing I discovered about the Blackwood family was that their pristine reputation had more cracks than a Charleston sidewalk after a hurricane. I spent 3 sleepless nights diving deep into public records, business filings, and news archives, fueled by coffee and the kind of righteous anger that makes you forget to eat. What started as curiosity about the family that wanted to own me became an obsession with understanding exactly how they'd built their empire. Blackwood Maritime Holdings wasn't just a shipping company. It was a sprawling network of subsidiaries, holding companies, and offshore entities that formed a web so complex it would make a spider dizzy. The deeper I dug, the more questions arose about how money flowed through their various enterprises. Port management contracts that seemed suspiciously lucrative. Real estate deals in developing areas that mysteriously received city development funds shortly after Blackwood involvement. Shipping routes that made unusual stops in ports known more for their lax customs enforcement than their strategic importance. But it was the environmental violations that first caught my attention. 3 separate incidents over the past 5 years where Blackwood vessels had dumped waste in protected marine areas. Each time, the fines were paid quietly, the violations settled out of court, and the incidents disappeared from public discussion faster than morning fog over the harbor. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental, and too well managed to be coincidental. I printed everything and spread it across my dining table, like a war room map. Financial documents, shipping manifests, regulatory filings, news clippings. The picture that emerged wasn't just of a wealthy family protecting old money. It was of a criminal enterprise hiding behind charitable galas and historic preservation donations. My phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. Mom wants to know if you've had time to review the prenup. Wedding planning is getting stressful without this resolved. I stared at the message for a long moment before turning my phone face down and returning to my research. By Thursday morning, I'd found something that made my hands shake as I held the printed document. A shipping manifest from 2 years ago listing cargo containers bound for a port in Myanmar that had been under international sanctions at the time. The manifest was signed by Richard Blackwood himself as chairman of the board. Either he was incredibly careless about international law, or Blackwood Maritime was actively engaged in sanctions busting. I called in sick to work and spent the day at the Charleston Public Library, using their computers to access databases my home internet couldn't reach. Government contractor records revealed that Blackwood companies had received over $30 million in port improvement grants over the past decade, most for projects that seemed to benefit their private shipping operations more than public commerce. The more I uncovered, the more I understood why the prenup was so restrictive. They weren't just protecting family wealth, they were protecting family secrets. The 50-year silence clause wasn't about preventing gossip. It was about preventing exposure of decades of questionable business practices that lived in the gray areas between legal creativity and outright fraud. Elena found me Saturday morning still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups like some kind of investigative hermit. "Jesus, Zoe, when's the last time you showered?" She started gathering the scattered documents. "What is all this?" I grabbed her wrist before she could shuffle the papers. "Don't move those. I have a system." She looked around at what appeared to be chaos but was actually carefully organized evidence of potential federal crimes. "Honey, you look terrible. When's the last time you slept?" "Sleep is for people who aren't engaged to money launderers." Elena sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. "Okay, start from the beginning. And please tell me you're not having some kind of paranoid breakdown?" I walked her through everything I'd found. The environmental violations, the sanctions busting, the suspicious government contracts, the offshore accounts that seemed designed to hide rather than organize. With each revelation, Elena's expression grew more serious. "Zoe, if even half of this is true, you're talking about federal crimes, RICO violations. This isn't just rich people being jerks. This is organized criminal activity." "I know." I sat down across from her, suddenly exhausted. "And they want me to sign a contract promising never to talk about any of it. Have you told Marcus?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Marcus, who asked me to just sign the prenup and trust that things would get better. Marcus, who sat there while his mother told me I should be grateful he's willing to marry beneath his station? That Marcus? Elena was quiet for a moment, studying the papers spread across my table. "What are you going to do with all this?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not signing that prenup. And I'm not walking away quietly like they expect me to. Zoe, these people have serious money and serious connections. If they're really doing what you think they're doing, they're not going to just let you expose them. Then they shouldn't have tried to buy my silence before I knew what they were hiding." Sunday morning brought another call from Victoria Blackwood. Her voice was strained despite her attempts to maintain her usual composed tone. "Zoe, darling, I'm afraid we need to discuss the prenuptial situation. The wedding is now less than 2 weeks away, and we simply must have this resolved. I've taken the liberty of making an appointment for you with David Chen this afternoon, just to clarify any remaining questions you might have." It wasn't a request. I arrived at Sterling & Associates to find not just David Chen but Richard Blackwood waiting in the conference room. The atmosphere was considerably less cordial than our previous meeting. Richard's usual detached demeanor had been replaced by something harder, more focused. "Miss Hartwell," David began without preamble, "I understand you have concerns about certain clauses in the prenuptial agreement. Perhaps we can address them directly." "My concerns go beyond the prenup," I said, settling into my chair with the confidence of someone who'd spent a week learning exactly how much leverage she actually had. I'm curious about Blackwood Maritime's business practices. The silence that followed was electric. Richard's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. David shuffled his papers nervously. "I'm not sure what you mean," Richard said finally. I opened my purse and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The shipping manifest with his signature, bound for sanctioned Myanmar. I placed it on the table between us and watched two men who were accustomed to controlling every conversation suddenly find themselves on unfamiliar ground. This manifest is dated 18 months ago. Myanmar was under comprehensive sanctions at the time. I'm wondering how a Blackwood vessel legally delivered cargo to a sanctioned port. David Chen had gone pale. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked at me like I was something more than an inconvenience. "Miss Hartwell, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of international shipping regulations. I don't think there is. I've spent considerable time researching those regulations, along with environmental protection laws, government contracting requirements, and financial disclosure obligations." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Richard and David exchanged a look that confirmed everything I suspected. They knew exactly what they'd been doing, and they knew exactly how much trouble they could be in if the right people started asking the right questions. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Richard asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. Your family's business practices appear to violate multiple federal laws. The prenup you want me to sign includes clauses specifically designed to prevent me from discussing those practices. Which makes me wonder what else you're hiding." David cleared his throat. "Miss Hartwell, I think perhaps we should schedule another meeting when everyone has had time to review the documents and consult with appropriate counsel." "I don't think that's necessary," I said, gathering my purse. "I think this meeting has been very informative." As I stood to leave, Richard spoke again. "Miss Hartwell, I hope you understand that families like ours have many responsibilities and pressures that outsiders might not fully comprehend. Sometimes business decisions that appear questionable to inexperienced observers are actually perfectly legitimate responses to complex international situations." I turned back to face him. "Mr. Blackwood, I may be from a small town, but I'm not naive. And I'm not inexperienced enough to mistake money laundering for complex international business." The drive home felt surreal. I'd just accused one of Charleston's most powerful men of federal crimes to his face, and instead of throwing me out or threatening legal action, he'd tried to explain it away, which meant either I was completely wrong about everything I'd found, or I was more right than I dared to hope. My phone started ringing before I'd even reached my apartment. Marcus, probably summoned by his father to do damage control. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while standing in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of his family's crimes. "Zoe, I don't know what happened in that meeting, but my dad is asking questions I don't know how to answer. Please call me back. We need to talk about this." I didn't call him back. Instead, I called Elena and asked her to come over with wine and moral support. When she arrived an hour later, I was sitting on my floor with documents arranged around me like tarot cards, predicting a very messy future. "They know I know," I told her without preamble. "How do they know you know?" I handed her the Myanmar shipping manifest. I showed them this. Elena studied the document, then looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Zoe, you confronted federal criminals with evidence of their crimes, alone, in their lawyer's office. I had to know if I was right. And I'm right. Their reaction confirmed everything." Elena poured herself a large glass of wine. "Okay, so now what? You can't marry into this family. You know that, right?" "I know. And you can't just pretend you never found any of this." "I know that too. So what's the plan?" I looked around at the papers that had consumed my life for the past week. Evidence of corruption that stretched back years and probably cost taxpayers millions of dollars. I'm going to make sure the right people see what I've found. The FBI? Eventually. But first, I'm going to give the Blackwood family a chance to experience the same kind of humiliation they tried to put me through. Elena set down her wine glass. Zoe, revenge fantasies are one thing, but these people are dangerous. If they're really running criminal enterprises, they're not going to just roll over because you embarrass them. They're not going to roll over anyway. But maybe if I hit them where it hurts most, their public reputation, they'll be too busy with damage control to come after me personally. And how exactly are you planning to hit their reputation? I smiled for the first time in days. I'm going to give them the wedding they deserve. The next morning brought a call from Marcus that I couldn't avoid. His voice was strained when I finally answered. Zoe, we need to meet. Now, I'm listening. Not over the phone. Can you come to the house? The Blackwood mansion sat on 2 acres of perfectly manicured grounds overlooking the Ashley River. Spanish moss dripped from ancient live oaks, and the circular driveway was lined with azaleas that would bloom in glorious profusion come spring. It was the kind of old Southern grandeur that made tourists stop and take pictures, a testament to generations of wealth and privilege. I'd been there dozens of times over the past year, usually for family dinners where I smiled politely while Victoria made subtle digs about my background and Richard ignored me entirely. Today felt different. Today I wasn't arriving as the grateful girlfriend from the wrong side of the tracks. Today I was walking into enemy territory, with full knowledge of what I was facing. Marcus met me at the front door, his usually perfect appearance disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been pacing and running his hands through his hair. Thank you for coming, he said, leading me toward his father's study. The study was Richard's domain, all dark wood and leather-bound books that probably hadn't been opened in decades. Hunting prints lined the walls between built-in bookshelves, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Richard sat behind it like a general planning a campaign, while Victoria occupied one of the leather chairs positioned strategically to face whoever was summoned before the desk. Zoe, Richard said without rising, please, sit down. I remained standing. I'll stand, thank you. Victoria's perfectly composed mask slipped just slightly. Darling, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot yesterday. Perhaps we can start fresh. I don't think there's anything fresh about this conversation, Mrs. Blackwood. Richard leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. Miss Hartwell, I'm going to be direct with you. You've made some very serious accusations based on documents you may not fully understand. That's concerning to me, both as Marcus's father and as a businessman who's worked hard to build a reputation in this community. I understand the documents perfectly, Mr. Blackwood. The question is whether you understand the legal implications of what they reveal. Marcus stepped forward. Zoe, please. Can we just talk about this rationally? Whatever you think you've found, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. I turned to look at him, this man I'd thought I loved, who was still choosing his family's version of reality over the evidence in front of his face. Marcus, your family's shipping company has violated federal sanctions, dumped toxic waste in protected waters, and received government contracts through what appears to be systematic fraud. The reasonable explanation is that they're criminals. Victoria's composure finally cracked. How dare you come into our home and make such accusations? We've shown you nothing but kindness, offered you opportunities you could never have imagined, and this is how you repay us? Kindness? I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. You've treated me like a gold-digging peasant from day one. The only kindness you've shown me is the willingness to let me disappear into your family's public image in exchange for signing away my legal right to ever discuss what I might learn about your criminal activities. Richard stood slowly, his full height imposing in the confines of the study. Miss Hartwell, I think you're making a very serious mistake. You're young, you're emotional, and you're misinterpreting complex business documents. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position before you do something that could have lasting consequences for everyone involved. The threat was clear, delivered with the same polite Southern menace that had built and maintained power in Charleston for centuries. But I'd spent too many nights uncovering their secrets to be intimidated by vague warnings. Mr. Blackwood, the only mistake I made was thinking your son was different from the rest of you. The lasting consequences you're worried about are the ones that come with federal investigations, not hurt feelings. I turned to Marcus one last time. I loved you. Or I loved who I thought you were. But that person was apparently just another construction of your family's carefully managed image. Zoe, wait. Marcus reached for my arm as I headed toward the door. We can work this out. Whatever problems you think exist, we can fix them. I stopped and looked back at the three of them, this family that had tried to buy my silence before I even knew what they were hiding. The only thing that needs fixing is your family's relationship with federal law. And I'm afraid that's beyond my capabilities. As I walked out of the Blackwood mansion for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Relief. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just the simple relief of finally understanding exactly where I stood and what I had to do next. The wedding was 6 days away, 6 days to make sure that when the Blackwood family's carefully constructed world came crashing down, it happened in front of everyone who mattered to them. 6 days to turn their celebration into their reckoning. The Charleston FBI field office sat in a nondescript building on Meeting Street, its federal anonymity contrasting sharply with the historic charm surrounding it. I'd driven past it 3 times before finally parking, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. The manila envelope beside me contained copies of everything I'd found, organized with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent her career cataloging historical artifacts. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez had agreed to meet with me after I'd called the public corruption hotline and mentioned Blackwood Maritime Holdings. Her voice on the phone had been professionally neutral, but when I mentioned sanctions violations and government contract fraud, I detected a sharpening of interest that suggested this wasn't the first time the Blackwood name had crossed federal radar. Agent Martinez was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that made you believe she'd never forgotten a detail in her life. Her handshake was firm, her office Spartanly functional, and her first question got straight to the point. Ms. Hartwell, before we begin, I need to understand your relationship to the Blackwood family and how you came by this information. I explained everything. The engagement, the prenup, my research, the confrontation at the lawyer's office. Agent Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. These are serious allegations, she said finally. What you're describing suggests violations of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Clean Water Act, and potentially the False Claims Act regarding government contracts. I know. That's why I'm here. She opened the envelope and began examining the documents. Her expression remained neutral, but I noticed how carefully she studied each page, particularly the Myanmar shipping manifest and the environmental violation settlements. Where did you obtain these documents? Most are from public records, business filings, regulatory databases, court documents. All legally accessible information. And the shipping manifests? I hesitated. Those came from sources I'd rather not specify. Agent Martinez looked up from the papers. Ms. Hartwell, if we're going to pursue this investigation, I need to know how you obtained potential evidence. Chain of custody matters in federal prosecutions. Let's just say that when you're engaged to someone, you occasionally have access to things that might not be publicly available. She made another note. I see. And what's your intention regarding your engagement and the upcoming wedding? The engagement is over. As for the wedding, well, I suppose that depends on how quickly federal investigations move. Agent Martinez almost smiled at that. Federal investigations move at their own pace, Ms. Hartwell. They're thorough, but they're not fast. What you've brought me will require months of investigation before any action is taken. My heart sank. I'd imagined FBI agents descending on the Blackwood mansion like something out of a movie, arrests made just in time to prevent the wedding from proceeding. The reality of bureaucratic timelines was far less cinematically satisfying. However, Agent Martinez continued, some of these documents are immediately concerning, particularly the sanctions violations. I'll need to consult with other agencies, but there may be grounds for expedited review. She walked me through the process: preliminary investigation, document authentication, interagency coordination, potential grand jury proceedings. It would take time, possibly years, before any public action resulted from what I'd brought her. In the meantime, she said, I'd advise you to be careful. If the Blackwood family suspects you've approached federal authorities, they may take steps to protect themselves. That could include attempting to discredit you or pressure you to recant your allegations. What kind of steps? Wealthy families facing potential federal prosecution have been known to use their resources creatively. Legal harassment, private investigators, character assassination. I'm not trying to frighten you, but you should be aware of the possibilities. I left the FBI office feeling both vindicated and deflated. Vindicated because a federal agent had taken my evidence seriously. Deflated because justice apparently moved at the speed of continental drift. The wedding was still 5 days away, and Marcus was still sending increasingly frantic text messages asking me to call him. That evening, Elena came over with Chinese takeout and moral support. So the FBI is investigating, but it'll take forever, and the wedding is still happening? Apparently. And you're just going to let Marcus marry someone else while his family continues their criminal enterprise? I looked up from my lo mein. Marcus isn't marrying someone else. He's marrying the idea of a wife his family has constructed. The question is whether I'm going to let him do it without understanding the true cost. What do you mean? I'd been thinking about this all afternoon, walking through downtown Charleston while tourists snapped photos of antebellum mansions built on slave labor. Old money, old secrets, old systems of power that persisted because people were too polite or too intimidated to challenge them directly. The Blackwood family's power comes from their reputation, their business relationships, their social connections, their political influence. It all depends on maintaining the image of respectability they've cultivated over generations. Elena nodded slowly. And you're thinking about attacking that image. I'm thinking about giving them the same choice they gave me. Sign a document that strips away everything important to them, or face the consequences of having their secrets exposed. Zoe, that sounds dangerously close to blackmail. No, blackmail would be demanding money or favors in exchange for silence. I'm not asking for anything except honesty. I spent the next 2 days crafting what I privately called my counter-prenup, a detailed document outlining everything I'd discovered about Blackwood Maritime Holdings, complete with supporting evidence and a timeline of violations stretching back almost a decade. At the end, I included a simple proposition: public acknowledgement of their business practices and voluntary cooperation with federal investigations, or public exposure at the most visible moment possible. I had the document printed and bound at a copy shop, then hand-delivered to David Chen's office, with instructions that it be forwarded to the Blackwood family immediately. The accompanying note was brief. Consider this my response to your prenuptial agreement. You have 48 hours to respond. Marcus called within 3 hours, his voice strained beyond recognition. Zoe, what the hell is this document you sent? My parents are losing their minds. It's exactly what it appears to be, a comprehensive review of your family's business practices. You can't be serious about this. You're talking about destroying my family's reputation over a business disagreement. Marcus, your family is engaged in criminal activity. This isn't a business disagreement. It's a choice between continuing to profit from illegal enterprises or facing the consequences of those choices. Jesus, Zoe, listen to yourself. You sound like some kind of radical activist. These are complex business issues that you don't fully understand. The dismissive tone in his voice triggered something primal in me. I understand perfectly, Marcus. Your family has been violating federal law for years, and they tried to buy my silence with a marriage contract that would have made me complicit in covering up their crimes. Now they have a choice to make. What choice? You're basically threatening to destroy us if we don't confess to crimes we haven't committed. I'm giving you the opportunity to control your own narrative. Voluntary cooperation looks very different from forced disclosure. There was a long silence on the line. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. Zoe? I don't know what happened to you, but this isn't the woman I fell in love with. The woman I loved wouldn't try to destroy the people who welcomed her into their family. The woman you loved never existed, Marcus. She was a fantasy you created because you needed someone who would disappear into your family's expectations without asking inconvenient questions. The woman I actually am is standing here telling you that your family's criminal behavior has consequences. Fine. The word came out sharp and final. If that's how you want to play this, then we'll play. But don't expect any mercy when this is over." He hung up, and I sat staring at my phone for several minutes. The man who'd once read me poetry and talked about building a life together had just threatened me for refusing to ignore his family's crimes. It was like watching the last remnants of an illusion finally dissolve completely. The response came the next morning, delivered by a courier who looked distinctly uncomfortable about whatever he'd been paid to transport. The envelope was thick, expensive, and bore the letterhead of Charleston's most prominent law firm. Inside was a letter that made the original prenup look like a love note. The Blackwood family, through their attorneys, was prepared to file defamation suits against me personally, seek restraining orders to prevent me from contacting family members or attending the wedding, and pursue criminal charges for theft of proprietary business documents. They characterized my evidence as misunderstood public records combined with stolen private communications taken without authorization during a period of romantic involvement. The legal language was dense and intimidating, clearly designed to overwhelm someone without significant resources to fight back. But buried in the threatening rhetoric was something interesting. They weren't denying the substance of my allegations. They were attacking my credibility and my right to possess the evidence, not the accuracy of the evidence itself. I called Agent Martinez and read her selected portions of the legal threat. They're trying to discredit the source rather than dispute the evidence. I told her, that's not uncommon in cases like this. Wealthy defendants often prefer character assassination to direct denial, because denial can be proven false. Personal attacks are harder to prosecute. What should I do about the legal threats? Consult with your own attorney. But understand that their primary goal is probably to intimidate you into backing down, not to actually pursue lengthy litigation that would keep their business practices in the public eye. That afternoon, I met with a lawyer Elena had recommended, a woman named Patricia Webb who specialized in whistleblower protection. Patricia reviewed the Blackwood family's legal threats with the kind of professional calm that came from years of dealing with powerful people trying to silence inconvenient truths. "They're fishing," she said after reading through the documents. "Most of these threats would be difficult to pursue successfully, and they know it. Truth is a defense against defamation, and public records can't be stolen. The question is whether you're prepared for a protracted legal battle that could cost significant money and emotional energy. What are my options? You could back down, sign whatever agreement they offer, and walk away. That's what they're hoping you'll do. And if I don't?" Patricia smiled grimly. "Then we fight. And given what you've uncovered, we might have more ammunition than they expect." That evening, I made my final decision. Not out of anger or revenge, but from a place of calm certainty about what needed to happen. The Blackwood family had spent generations building power through carefully managed secrecy. They'd maintained their position by ensuring that anyone who might threaten their reputation was either bought off, intimidated into silence, or socially destroyed. But they'd made a critical error with me. They'd assumed that because I came from modest circumstances, because I loved their son, because I wanted to belong, I would ultimately choose comfort over conscience. They'd miscalculated the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose. I spent my last evening as Marcus Blackwood's fiancé organizing everything I'd learned into a presentation that would be impossible to ignore or misinterpret. Photos, documents, financial records, environmental reports, all arranged in a clear narrative that showed exactly how one of Charleston's most respected families had built their fortune on systematic lawbreaking. The wedding was tomorrow. By this time next week, either the Blackwood family would be cooperating with federal investigators, or they'd be facing the kind of public scrutiny that no amount of old money could buy their way out of. I'd originally planned to simply skip the wedding, to let my absence speak for itself while the FBI investigation proceeded through official channels. But the legal threats had changed my perspective. If the Blackwood family wanted to play hardball, if they wanted to try to destroy me for refusing to be complicit in their crimes, then they were going to learn exactly what kind of opponent they'd chosen to make. The historic Magnolia Estate would host Charleston Society's event of the season tomorrow. 200 guests, including judges, politicians, business leaders, and social influencers who shaped public opinion throughout the region. The perfect audience for the kind of revelation that could topple a criminal empire built on respectability. I set my alarm for early morning and went to bed with the peaceful sleep of someone who'd finally decided to stop being afraid of powerful people, who'd forgotten that power without accountability was just organized crime in formal wear. Tomorrow, the Blackwood family would get the wedding they deserved. And Charleston society would get the truth they'd been politely ignoring for decades. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect Charleston spring day that made tourists believe in Southern magic. Azaleas bloomed in violent profusion throughout the city, their pink and white petals carpeting sidewalks like nature's own wedding confetti. I stood at my bedroom window watching the sun paint golden highlights on the Ashley River, feeling remarkably calm for someone about to detonate a bomb in the middle of high society. My phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m. with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Wedding vendors, probably, trying to coordinate last-minute details for the event that would make or break their reputations among Charleston's elite. I'd turned off notifications hours ago, but the constant vibration served as a reminder that across town, an army of florists, caterers, and event planners were transforming the historic Magnolia Estate into the backdrop for what everyone expected to be the social event of the season. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy silk dress that struck the perfect balance between respectful and memorable. Not white, obviously, since I wasn't the bride, but elegant enough to command attention when the moment came. I'd learned over the past year of attending Blackwood family events that presentation mattered enormously to their social circle. The message had to be delivered by someone who looked like she belonged, even if she was about to prove she never really had. Elena arrived at 9, carrying coffee and the kind of nervous energy that comes from watching your best friend prepare to commit social suicide. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked for the dozenth time in 3 days. "I'm sure." I sipped the coffee and checked my reflection one more time. The question isn't whether I should do this. The question is whether anyone else would if they knew what I know. Most people would take the FBI route and let justice run its course. Most people don't understand that justice for wealthy families runs through different courts than justice for everyone else. The FBI investigation could take years, and even if they find evidence of wrongdoing, prosecuting prominent citizens requires political will that doesn't always exist. Elena sat on my bed, looking at the carefully organized documents I'd assembled into what I privately called my wedding gift for the Blackwood family. What if this backfires? What if people don't believe you or think you're just a scorned ex-fiancé making things up? Then I'll have learned something important about the people whose opinions I thought mattered. I sealed the last of the evidence packets, each one labeled with a guest's name from the wedding invitation list I'd memorized during months of planning what I'd thought would be my own celebration. But I don't think that's going to happen. Truth has a way of ringing clear, especially when it's backed up by documented evidence. The drive to the historic Magnolia Estate took 40 minutes through Charleston's winding historic streets. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like tattered wedding veils, and the scent of Confederate jasmine drifted through my open windows. It was the kind of scenery that made the city famous, the romantic backdrop that drew couples from around the world to pledge their love in one of America's most beautiful settings. The estate itself sat on 20 acres of manicured gardens overlooking the Ashley River. Its antebellum mansion restored to magazine-perfect condition by previous generations of Charleston preservationists. White columns supported wraparound porches, and formal gardens cascaded down toward the water in carefully planned waves of color and texture. It was exactly the kind of venue that old Charleston families used to showcase their continued relevance in a changing world. I parked among the other early arrivals and walked toward the main house, my heels clicking on brick pathways laid down before the Civil War. Staff members bustled around making final preparations, hanging garlands of white roses and magnolia leaves, arranging chairs in perfect rows facing an altar positioned to catch the golden afternoon light. Everything looked exactly as Victoria Blackwood had planned during months of meticulous preparation. "Zoe?" A voice called from behind me, and I turned to see Cassandra Blackwood approaching with the kind of hesitant smile that suggested she wasn't sure whether I was still welcome at family events. Marcus's sister had always been kind to me, caught between her natural warmth and her mother's expectations. "Hello, Cassie." I kissed her cheek in the traditional Charleston greeting, noting how she tensed slightly at the contact. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Marcus said there had been some misunderstanding about the prenup. "There was no misunderstanding. Your family made their expectations very clear." Cassie's smile faltered. "I'm sorry things got complicated. I always hoped you and Marcus would work things out." "Some things can't be worked out, Cassie. Some things just have to be faced honestly." Before she could respond, Victoria Blackwood's voice cut across the garden like a blade. "Zoe, I'm surprised to see you here." I turned to face the woman who'd tried to buy my silence with a marriage contract designed to erase my identity. Victoria looked magnificent in pale lavender silk, every hair perfectly positioned, every piece of jewelry carefully chosen to suggest wealth without ostentation. She was the picture of Southern gentility, gracious hostess welcoming guests to her son's wedding. "Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for including me in your guest list." Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm afraid there may have been some confusion. Given recent developments, I wasn't certain you'd still want to attend. I wouldn't miss it for the world. This is going to be a very memorable day." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, some instinct warning her that my presence represented more than social awkwardness. "Well, I hope you'll enjoy the ceremony. If you'll excuse me, I have last-minute details to coordinate." She swept away toward the main house, leaving Cassie looking confused and uncomfortable. "Zoe, what's really going on?" "Marcus has been acting strange all week, and now you're talking in riddles." "You'll understand everything soon enough, Cassie. I promise." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of arriving guests and mounting tension. Charleston's elite descended on the estate in luxury cars and chauffeur-driven sedans, the men resplendent in morning coats, and the women showcasing the kind of understated elegance that could only be achieved with unlimited budgets and generational style education. Judges chatted with business leaders, politicians mingled with philanthropists, and social media influencers documented every detail for followers who lived vicariously through Charleston's high society events. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting people I'd met at previous Blackwood gatherings, accepting condolences about my broken engagement with gracious smiles that revealed nothing about my actual intentions. Several people mentioned how well I was handling the situation, how mature it was of me to attend Marcus's wedding despite everything. If they only knew. At 2 o'clock, guests began taking their seats for the ceremony. I positioned myself in the middle section, close enough to the front to be clearly visible but far enough back to avoid immediate family scrutiny. The processional music began, a string quartet playing selections from Pachelbel that echoed across the gardens with crystalline beauty. Marcus appeared at the altar looking handsome and nervous in his formal wear, flanked by groomsmen who represented Charleston's next generation of inherited power. He scanned the assembled guests, his eyes finding mine for just a moment before quickly looking away. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept adjusting his tie like it was too tight. The bridesmaids processed down the aisle in blush pink silk, Victoria's carefully chosen palette designed to complement the spring garden setting. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The arrival of the bride who would finally make Marcus Blackwood a properly married man. Except no bride appeared. The music continued, guests began murmuring and turning in their seats, and Richard Blackwood strode quickly toward the main house with the purposeful gait of a man dealing with a crisis. Marcus looked confused, then concerned, then increasingly panicked as minutes passed without explanation. Victoria appeared at the back of the seating area, her composure cracking as she whispered urgently to several family members. Phone calls were made, staff members dispatched on mysterious errands, and the assembled guests began speculating about what could have caused such an unprecedented delay. I knew exactly what had happened because I'd planned it. The bride, Marcus's new fiancé, whom he'd proposed to just 3 weeks after our engagement ended, had received a very special wedding gift that morning. A comprehensive package detailing exactly what kind of family she was marrying into, complete with evidence of criminal activity and a personal note explaining that silence about these activities was apparently a traditional requirement for Blackwood wives. Somewhere in the estate's bridal suite, a young woman who thought she was marrying Charleston royalty was learning that her future in-laws were sophisticated criminals who expected their family members to be complicit in covering up decades of illegal business practices. The prenup she'd already signed included the same 50-year silence clause that had been presented to me, the same restrictions on career and financial independence, the same erasure of personal identity in service of family image. The difference was that she'd had the information I hadn't possessed when I was in her position. She'd been able to make an informed choice about whether the Blackwood name was worth the cost of her integrity. Apparently, she decided it wasn't. Richard returned from the house with the kind of grim expression that suggested catastrophic news delivered in private. He approached the altar where Marcus waited with increasing desperation, spoke quietly for several moments, then stepped back as his son's face went white. Marcus grabbed the microphone intended for wedding vows and spoke to the assembled guests with a voice that shook, despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we need to postpone today's ceremony. The bride is experiencing a medical emergency that requires immediate attention." The crowd erupted in concerned murmurs, but I noticed several guests checking their phones and finding messages that had arrived during the ceremony. The same messages I'd scheduled to be delivered simultaneously to every major media outlet in Charleston, every federal agency with jurisdiction over maritime commerce, and every member of Charleston's business and political establishment. Judge Morrison, one of Richard's golf partners, stood abruptly and walked toward the parking area with his phone pressed to his ear. Two city council members followed close behind, their faces grave, as they scrolled through what I assumed were copies of the same evidence package that had convinced the bride to flee. Victoria appeared at Marcus's side, her voice carrying clearly in the spring air as she attempted damage control. "I'm sure everyone understands that medical emergencies take precedence over social obligations. We'll reschedule the ceremony once this situation is resolved." But the careful choreography of the event was already collapsing. More guests were checking phones, making calls, gathering in small groups that buzzed with increasingly urgent conversations. Richard's business associates were departing without explanation, and several prominent society figures were heading for their cars with the kind of purposeful haste that suggested they wanted distance from whatever scandal was developing. I stood and began walking toward the front of the seating area, my heels clicking on the brick pathway with deliberate rhythm. Conversations quieted as people noticed my movement, some recognizing me as the previous fiancé whose presence had become suddenly much more significant. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the garden air. "I believe I can explain what's happening here." Marcus's face went from white to gray. Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. Richard's jaw tightened as he realized that his family's careful management of the situation was about to be completely destroyed by the woman they'd tried to silence with a marriage contract. "For those of you checking your phones," I continued, "you're finding evidence that Blackwood Maritime Holdings has been violating federal sanctions, environmental regulations, and government contracting laws for almost a decade. The bride you came to see marry into this family received the same information this morning, along with copies of the prenuptial agreement that would have required her to sign away her legal right to discuss these criminal activities." The garden fell completely silent, except for the sound of Spanish moss rustling in the river breeze. 200 of Charleston's most prominent citizens sat frozen as the implications of my words sank in. The Blackwood family tried to buy my silence with a similar agreement when Marcus and I were engaged. When I refused to sign it, they threatened legal action to prevent me from discussing what I'd learned about their business practices. Today seems like an appropriate time to honor that commitment to transparency. Judge Morrison had stopped walking and turned back toward the ceremony area, his expression grim as he processed what he was hearing. Several other guests were pulling up documents on their phones, scrolling through evidence that painted a very different picture of the family they'd come to celebrate. Richard stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling difficult situations. "Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Hartwell is obviously distraught about personal matters. I'm sure you'll understand that accusations made during emotional distress shouldn't be given undue credence." "You're absolutely right, Mr. Blackwood," I replied. "Accusations shouldn't be given credence without supporting evidence. That's why everything I've stated today is documented in the materials being reviewed by federal investigators as we speak." Victoria tried one last attempt at damage control. "I think we should all remember that weddings are celebrations of love and family, not appropriate venues for discussing complex business matters that require proper legal review." Mrs. Blackwood, you're right that this isn't an appropriate venue for discussing criminal activity. Unfortunately, your family chose to make criminal activity a family business, which makes it difficult to separate personal celebrations from illegal enterprises. The exodus began slowly, then accelerated as the reality of the situation became clear. Prominent guests who'd arrived planning to network and celebrate were departing as quickly as dignity allowed, their association with the Blackwood family suddenly a liability rather than an asset. Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Zoe, why are you doing this?" "Because you gave me a choice, Marcus. Sign a document that would make me complicit in covering up crimes, or face the consequences of refusing to be silent about them." I chose consequences. As guests continued streaming toward the parking area, their carefully planned social event dissolving into scandal and speculation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just the clean relief of finally telling the truth in a place where truth mattered more than politeness. The historic Magnolia Estate, chosen for its beauty and prestige, had become the backdrop for the exposure of one of Charleston's most respected families, as sophisticated criminals who'd hidden behind charitable donations and social prominence for decades. The wedding was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The aftermath of the wedding was swift and merciless in a way that only Charleston society could deliver. Within hours, the video of my revelation had spread across social media like wildfire, shared by guests who'd recorded the moment on their phones, and reporters who'd somehow materialized at the estate, despite the private nature of the event. By evening, every major news outlet in the Southeast was running stories about the Blackwood family's alleged criminal enterprise, complete with leaked documents that corroborated every accusation I'd made. I spent that first night at Elena's house, my phone turned off and my curtains drawn against the news vans that had appeared outside my apartment building. Elena moved through her kitchen with the focused energy of someone trying to process catastrophic events through normal activities, making tea and grilled cheese sandwiches, while CNN played footage of FBI agents arriving at Blackwood Maritime Holdings with search warrants. "They moved fast," she said, settling onto the couch beside me with steaming mugs. "They were already investigating. My wedding speech just gave them public pressure to act quickly instead of spending months on preliminary reviews." The local news was brutal in its coverage. Decades of environmental violations, sanctions busting, and fraudulent government contracts laid out in excruciating detail. The reporter noted that anonymous sources had provided comprehensive documentation, including recorded conversations and internal company communications that suggested systematic criminal activity spanning multiple federal jurisdictions. "The Blackwood family has not responded to requests for comment," the anchor concluded. But sources close to the investigation suggest that federal prosecutors are treating this as a potential RICO case given the organized nature of the alleged criminal enterprise. Elena muted the television and turned to study my face. "How are you feeling? And don't say fine, because fine people don't usually destroy prominent families on wedding days." I considered the question seriously. How was I feeling? Not triumphant, despite having accomplished exactly what I'd set out to do. Not guilty, despite having devastated people I'd once cared about. Mostly, I felt empty in the way that comes after finishing something that required every ounce of emotional energy you possessed. "I feel like I can breathe again," I said finally. "For months I've been carrying the weight of knowing what they were doing and feeling complicit for not speaking up. Now that it's out there, now that other people know and are taking action, I feel like I can finally exhale." "What about Marcus?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. Marcus, who'd called 17 times before I turned off my phone. Marcus, who'd sent text messages that ranged from fury to pleading to threats. Marcus, who'd probably spent his wedding night in emergency meetings with criminal defense attorneys instead of celebrating with his bride. Marcus made his choice when he asked me to sign that prenup. He chose family loyalty over moral courage, and I chose moral courage over family acceptance. We're both living with the consequences of those choices. The next morning brought a knock on Elena's door that we both knew wasn't the mailman. Agent Martinez stood on the front porch with coffee, and the kind of expression that suggested she'd been working through the night. "Miss Hartwell, we need to talk." Elena's living room became an impromptu interview space as Agent Martinez spread documents across the coffee table and pulled out a digital recorder. First, I want to thank you for the information you provided. The evidence has been invaluable in advancing our investigation. How much trouble am I in for the way I obtained some of those documents? Agent Martinez smiled grimly. Legally speaking, you didn't steal anything. You accessed information through legitimate means during the course of a romantic relationship, and everything you provided either came from public records or was voluntarily shared with you. The Blackwood family's attorneys are arguing otherwise, but their legal position is weak. She activated the recorder and began walking me through a formal statement, detailing how I discovered the evidence, what had motivated me to investigate, and what I'd observed during my interactions with the family. The process took 3 hours, interrupted periodically by phone calls that Agent Martinez took in the next room with lowered voices and urgent tones. The investigation is moving quickly, she explained during one break. Federal prosecutors are treating this as a priority case because of the international sanctions violations. When prominent American families help foreign governments evade sanctions, it becomes a national security issue. What happens next? Grand jury proceedings, probably within weeks rather than months. The evidence you provided, combined with what we've seized during searches, should be sufficient for multiple felony indictments. And the family? Agent Martinez's expression hardened. Richard Blackwood was arrested this morning on charges related to sanctions violations. Victoria Blackwood is being questioned about her role in the family foundation that appears to have been used to launder proceeds from illegal activities. Marcus Hazen Blackwood has retained counsel but hasn't been charged with any crimes yet. The news hit me like a physical blow despite being exactly what I'd expected. Hearing that people I'd shared holiday dinners with were being arrested for federal crimes felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. Ms. Hartwell, I need to ask you about your personal safety. Families facing this level of federal scrutiny sometimes take desperate measures. Have you received any threats, or noticed anything unusual? I thought about the unmarked cars I'd seen near my apartment, the phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize, the strange feeling of being watched that had started the day after the wedding. Maybe, I'm not sure. Agent Martinez made notes and promised that federal marshals would provide security monitoring while the investigation proceeded. The conversation ended with warnings about media contact and instructions to call immediately if I felt threatened or unsafe. After she left, Elena and I sat in silence for a long time, processing the reality that my decision to expose the Blackwood family had set in motion events that would reshape Charleston's power structure for years to come. The media attention was relentless for the first week. Reporters called constantly, offering money for exclusive interviews about my relationship with Marcus and my knowledge of the family's criminal activities. I declined all requests, following Agent Martinez's advice to let the federal investigation proceed without interference from media speculation. But Charleston society had already rendered its verdict. The Blackwood family name, once synonymous with prestige and respectability, became toxic overnight. Business associates distanced themselves, social invitations were quietly rescinded, and charitable organizations that had courted Blackwood donations suddenly discovered ethical concerns about accepting money from families under federal investigation. Victoria's arrest came 2 weeks after Richard's, accompanied by footage of her being led from the family mansion in handcuffs, while news helicopters circled overhead. The charges included money laundering, conspiracy to violate federal sanctions, and tax evasion related to offshore accounts that had hidden millions in illegal profits. Marcus called me the night his mother was arrested, his voice hollow with exhaustion and defeat. "Zoe, I need to see you. Please." Against my better judgment and Elena's strong objections, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, far from the reporters who'd been stalking his usual haunts. He looked like he'd aged years in the 2 weeks since the wedding, his usual polished appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and the kind of hollow-eyed exhaustion that comes from sleeping badly and eating worse. "They're talking about RICO charges," he said without preamble. "The prosecutors think our whole family is some kind of organized crime syndicate. Aren't you?" He flinched like I'd slapped him. "We were a shipping company that made some questionable business decisions. We weren't the mafia." "Marcus, your family systematically violated federal law for almost a decade. You hid profits in offshore accounts, bribed foreign officials, and used charitable foundations to launder money. That's not questionable business decisions." That's organized crime with better PR. You destroyed us, Zoe. Everything my family built over generations, gone. Because you couldn't accept that business sometimes requires moral compromises. I studied his face, looking for any sign of the man I'd thought I loved, any recognition that his family's actions had consequences beyond their personal inconvenience. Your family destroyed itself, Marcus. I just refused to help cover it up. The prenup wasn't about covering anything up. It was about protecting family privacy. The prenup was about ensuring that if I discovered your family's crimes, I'd be legally prohibited from reporting them. That's not privacy protection. That's obstruction of justice with a marriage license attached. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his untouched coffee. What am I supposed to do now? My parents are facing decades in federal prison. Our business is frozen pending criminal proceedings. Everything I thought my life would be just disappeared. You could try being honest for the first time in your adult life. Cooperate with investigators, testify truthfully about what you knew and when you knew it, and maybe build something legitimate instead of inheriting something criminal. Easy for you to say. You're not the one losing everything. I lost everything when I learned that the man I loved was complicit in his family's crimes and expected me to be complicit too. The difference is that I chose to lose things that turned out to be built on lies anyway. Marcus left without saying goodbye, and I never spoke to him again. 6 months later, he pled guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and cooperation with ongoing investigations. His testimony helped prosecutors secure convictions against his parents, who each received prison sentences that would keep them behind bars well into their 70s. The Blackwood maritime empire was dismantled piece by piece, its assets sold to satisfy criminal forfeiture requirements and victim compensation funds. The family mansion was auctioned to pay legal fees, and the charitable foundation was dissolved after investigators discovered it had been used primarily to hide illegal profits rather than fund legitimate philanthropic activities. Charleston society adapted to the Blackwood family's fall with the resilient pragmatism that had allowed it to survive wars, economic upheavals, and social revolutions for centuries. New families rose to fill the power vacuum. New charitable organizations replaced the compromised Blackwood Foundation, and new business leaders emerged to take over contracts and relationships that had once been Blackwood monopolies. The broader impact extended far beyond Charleston's social circles. Federal investigators used evidence from the Blackwood case to launch investigations into similar family-controlled enterprises throughout the Southeast, uncovering a network of interconnected criminal activities that had operated for decades under the cover of legitimate business and social respectability. My own life underwent transformations I'd never anticipated. The museum promoted me to head curator after the previous director resigned under pressure from board members who disapproved of my high-profile role in exposing Charleston's most prominent family. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and the kind of professional respect I'd been working toward for years. More importantly, I received job offers from museums around the country, institutions that valued both my professional qualifications and my demonstrated willingness to prioritize integrity over social acceptance. I eventually accepted a position at a prestigious museum in Washington, D.C., where my Charleston connections became professional assets rather than social liabilities. The personal cost was substantial, but not devastating. Old friendships withered as people chose sides, or simply decided that association with me was too controversial for their comfort. Social invitations stopped coming, not out of hostility but from the practical recognition that my presence at events would inevitably dominate conversations in ways that made other guests uncomfortable. But new relationships formed with people who respected what I'd done, rather than resenting its consequences. Fellow museum professionals, federal investigators working on similar cases, journalists covering government corruption, and activists fighting various forms of institutional misconduct. I discovered that communities exist for people who choose truth over comfort, and that belonging to such communities brings its own form of social satisfaction. The legal threats from Blackwood attorneys evaporated once their clients were indicted on federal charges. It's difficult to pursue defamation claims when the alleged defamation consists of truthful statements about criminal activity that's been confirmed by federal prosecutors. Patricia Webb, my attorney, noted with satisfaction that wealthy families often discover their legal intimidation tactics become useless once their victims refuse to be intimidated. Agent Martinez kept me informed about the progress of various investigations that had grown out of the original Blackwood case. The sanctions violations had uncovered a broader network of American companies, helping sanctioned regimes evade international penalties. The environmental crimes had revealed systematic corruption in regulatory agencies that had allowed repeated violations to go unpunished. The government contracting fraud had exposed bid-rigging schemes that had cost taxpayers millions of dollars over multiple decades. Your decision to come forward started something much bigger than you probably realized, she told me during one of our periodic check-ins. The Blackwood family was just one node in a network of corruption that were still unraveling. 2 years after the wedding that never happened, I attended a different kind of ceremony. The Department of Justice held a press conference announcing the conclusion of Operation Maritime Justice, a comprehensive investigation that had resulted in over 40 indictments and the recovery of hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. Agent Martinez was promoted to supervisory special agent, and several prosecutors involved in the cases received recognition for their work on complex, white-collar crime prosecutions. I wasn't officially recognized at the ceremony, but Agent Martinez made sure I understood that the entire investigation had begun, with evidence I'd provided and my willingness to testify truthfully about what I'd observed. The ripple effects of my decision to reject the Blackwood family's prenup had ultimately dismantled criminal enterprises across multiple states and prevented continued violations of laws designed to protect national security and environmental safety. Standing in the back of that federal courthouse conference room, listening to prosecutors describe the scope of corruption that had been exposed and prosecuted, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not pride, exactly, but a deep satisfaction that came from knowing I'd chosen correctly when faced with an impossible choice between personal happiness and moral courage. The woman who'd walked into David Chen's office 18 months earlier, prepared to sign whatever document would secure her place in Charleston society, no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood that some prices are too high to pay, no matter how attractive the purchase might appear. Marcus was released from federal prison after serving 14 months. His sentence reduced because of his cooperation with ongoing investigations. He moved to Atlanta and found work with a logistics company, rebuilding his life far from Charleston and the ruins of his family's empire. We never contacted each other, but mutual acquaintances occasionally provided updates that suggested he was making genuine efforts to live honestly for the first time in his adult life. The Blackwood family name faded from Charleston society with surprising speed, becoming a cautionary tale rather than a source of envy. New families rose to prominence, hopefully with better understanding of the relationship between power and accountability. The charitable causes that had benefited from Blackwood donations found new sponsors, often with more transparent giving practices and stronger ethical oversight. Elena visited me in Washington 6 months after I'd settled into my new position, marveling at the professional opportunities and personal freedom I'd discovered once I'd stopped trying to fit into spaces where I'd never really belonged. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked as we toured the Smithsonian galleries where I now worked. Walking away from all that wealth and status? I considered the question while we stood before a display about American social movements, thinking about all the people throughout history who'd chosen principle over comfort, truth over acceptance, courage over security. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that people I cared about turned out to be criminals who expected me to be complicit in their crimes. But I don't regret refusing to sign that prenup, and I don't regret exposing what they were hiding. Even knowing what it would cost you?" "Elena, I didn't lose anything real. I lost the illusion of belonging to a family that never actually wanted me, just a version of me that would disappear into their expectations. I lost access to wealth that was stolen from taxpayers and environmental protection. I lost social connections with people who valued appearances more than integrity." I gestured toward the museum galleries around us, filled with art and artifacts that told stories of human achievement and creativity. What I gained was the ability to build something legitimate, to work for institutions that create value instead of hiding crimes, to form relationships with people who respect honesty over social positioning. "And you're happy?" I smiled, thinking about the exhibition I was curating on American whistleblowers throughout history, the colleagues who valued my professional skills and personal courage, the life I'd built based on my own choices rather than someone else's expectations. I'm free. And freedom, it turns out, is much more valuable than acceptance into a family of criminals who expected me to help them hide their crimes in exchange for the privilege of carrying their name. The wedding that never happened had become the beginning of everything that mattered. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones where we choose who we're going to be instead of accepting who others expect us to become. The Blackwood family had tried to buy my silence with a marriage contract designed to erase my identity and ensure my complicity in their criminal enterprise. Instead, they'd given me the opportunity to discover exactly how much courage I possessed when everything I thought I wanted was offered, in exchange for everything I actually believed. In the end, the choice had been simple. Sign a document that would make me complicit in covering up crimes, or refuse and face the consequences of maintaining my integrity. The consequences had been severe but temporary. The integrity had turned out to be permanent. 2 years later, standing in a museum dedicated to preserving truth and educating future generations, I knew I'd chosen correctly. The Blackwood family's criminal empire was dismantled. Their victims had received compensation, and future crimes had been prevented by the exposure of their methods. Most importantly, I'd learned that belonging to something legitimate was infinitely more valuable than belonging to something prestigious but corrupt. The prenup they'd wanted me to sign would have purchased a lifetime of comfortable complicity in exchange for a few years of social status among people whose opinions turned out to matter far less than I'd believed. Instead, I'd chosen to belong to myself, to my principles, and to communities that valued truth over appearances. The wedding dress I'd never worn was hanging in some consignment shop, but the integrity I'd chosen instead would last forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.